all actions take place in what's called in the book the fog of war. Stop. They're paralyzed by what could happen. The real question for you is, have you prepared them to deal with that situation? To me, that's the worst. Laziness is unforgivable. Or am I creating an environment where people are dependent on me because it makes me feel good? How do you reduce fear in your organization? Your experienced people have to bring the less experienced along, regardless of titles. Why study warfighting, and how could it be applicable to your organization? Well, warfighting is the Marine Corps' primary document, primary book that everybody reads that really sets the tone for how the Marine Corps and the Marines within it prepare to go to war and what they do when they get there. If your team has problems dealing with uncertainty, if you struggle sometimes with tasks that should be simple, for whatever reason become very complicated, if you have a lot of changing situations, people that struggle with that, or maybe you're short of time, seemingly short of time to plan and execute more than you'd like, reading Warfighting is going to help you out. It's going to help your people out. In this video, I'll summarize the key points of the first part of the book. Hi, I'm Mike Targos. I'm a retired Marine and leadership coach. I founded Center Desk Leadership Coaching to help primarily new managers or new leaders get their feet on the ground and learn how to get better. If you find this video helpful, if you could like and subscribe, share it. It'd be great to see some comments of what people think about it. Warfighting was first published in 1989 and meant to serve as the basic philosophy of all Marines. All Marines read this. Maybe you have something in your organization that everybody reads when they join. It's not a history book. It's a basic philosophy book, how we approach war and how to prepare for it. It distinguishes the Marine Corps, and it's not meant to be a how-to guide, but rather, as it says in the foreword, shape the way people think about things. There's no specific techniques or procedures in the book. Rather, it talks in the form of concepts and values. Teaching somebody how to think, not what to think. And it's meant to be read from cover to cover. It's not something to pick up, find a piece of it, and then apply it. I think it's a type of book you might consider writing for your own organization. Maybe it doesn't need to be 100 pages, but you need to have something that says what your company is about, what the values are, maybe a little bit about the history and why you do the things the way you do. I can help you write something like that if you want. One of the major themes of the book is that the nature of war doesn't change. However, our approach to planning for and conducting war must. And you can see this really easily in the business environment with the changing dynamics. Companies that were once huge no longer are. Failure to adapt to the environment. The same tactics won't necessarily give you the same results. First of 4 chapters is entitled The Nature of War. The opening quote from the book from a Prussian military general and strategist, Karl von Clausewitz. Everything in war is simple, but the simplest thing is difficult. He's laying the groundwork for a concept that he calls friction. Friction is central to the whole book, and it's applicable to a lot of things that you deal with. And it's central to the nature of war. And it's important to understand the environment that you're dealing with. Maybe it's your business environment, your industry. Maybe it could be just your team of people that you have right now. The dynamics that affect them and the way they think about things and make decisions. The way war is defined is primarily it's a clash of opposing wills, a clash of interests characterized by the use of military force. Now, that part is not applicable to you, but you do have competitors out there. You do have people that you don't even know about trying to take your business. Internally, you have people opposing your plans, and we all know the feeling of competing for resources or fighting the clock. These are all parallels that you can consider the principles of this book. And as the book says, the important part of that is you have 2 irreconcilable wills. That same philosopher calls it Weikampf, where the 2 struggle, and suggests thinking about it as if you can picture 2 wrestlers locked up and trying to throw each other. It's a good image for what they're trying to say here. Highly interactive, highly opposed to each other. And this is useful because a lot of times I think we look at situations a little bit too sterile and static. We have what we want to do, and we have this inanimate object, as the book calls it, that just needs to be convinced or rolled over. Whereas what we need to think about is we have opposition, and why do we have that opposition? What motivates, where do they get their power? This is also the problem with a lot of planning efforts is they're too static. They don't take into account the change that could occur in the future, the small dynamics that could have what the book calls decisive effects later on, or disproportionate changes in what you're trying to do, even from something very small. And the objective in war is to impose your will on the enemy. And you may not have an enemy, but you do. But if you're a leader, you know the feeling of needing to impose your will, whether it's just a normal change effort or whether it's a whole scale redirection of the team. You have a range of options yourself, all the way from things that you simply just say to the group or say to individuals, all the way to making big changes, big people changes in your organization, big changes in your production process, cutting unprofitable parts of the business, whatever it is. Another key point of the book is that total war and total peace rarely exist. Think of whether or not you think of things too much in terms of good and bad or black and white. And that's what the book is talking about here, is usually we have some shade of gray. And I remember thinking this in Iraq, is you had people that you were working with, but they weren't necessarily good or totally on your side. Same thing with Afghanistan. Everybody has their own set of self-interests, always in some sort of state of struggle. Maybe you have one part of the team that is really excited about going in a certain direction that you've just thrown out there or talked about, but the other part of the team isn't. This is an example of that. And these opposing viewpoints really set the conditions for what was mentioned at the start of that section, which is the seemingly simple becomes complicated. And this is one of the reasons is we have people that don't agree or even subtly don't agree, even though it looks like they might. And this can really slow down what you're trying to do. And then, as the book talks about later, you have things that just happen, are pure chance. To look at friction a little bit more in depth, we have the idea of two opposing wills, that wrestler image that you can picture, force that, quote, makes the seemingly so simple difficult, from Clausewitz. You have a couple different types of friction, and this is one of the things that I find myself thinking about a lot, is you have external friction and internal. So the external may be things like your market dynamics, your clients or your customers changing direction on you without you anticipating such. But then you also have internal friction, which is self-induced. And I think any manager, any leader's goal is to reduce the internal friction to just about nothing. But as the book states, whether or not you can do that or not, and it's probably safe to assume that you can't do it entirely, you do need to prepare and lead an organization that's able to deal with that friction. But you're never going to totally influence external. This is the idea of the two opposing wills. A couple ideas or a couple examples in the book of internal friction are goals that are not clear, lack of coordination, or one of my favorite ones is complicated plans. You may have seen plans where the people coming up with the plans don't even fully understand it the same way as a group, but yet it moves forward, and the people that have to execute surely don't understand it or surely don't have the same appreciation. Overly complicated plans. And then the military, you have this thing called command relationships, which the more senior you get, the more concerned you are, which is essentially who works for who and who can tell who to do what. And in large organizations or large military operations, this can get very complicated really quick. But in your team, is it clear who works for who? Is it clear who's responsible for what? Do you have a RACI matrix? Responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. Do you have something that simple that says who is responsible and accountable for what? The book also says that the primary attribute to overcome friction is the individual human will. And if you think about it, when you're working and you come up against some kind of obstacle, what do? A lot of people will just stop, complain, or just stop working altogether. As you want to develop a team and lead a team that has the will to push through to solve problems at their level and keep going. So you can see that even though you have friction, you can influence your ability to fight and operate amidst all that friction. Are your people motivated to push through it? Do they have the will to push through it? Napoleon said that the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. So it's not just a matter about, or it's just not a matter of how many guns do you have, how many troops do you have. The moral or the mental state of your people is at least 3 times as powerful as the physical. Do you consider that? Do you consider how motivated your people are and what you're doing? What are you doing to raise their will, to increase their level of will, to help them push through those minor obstacles? Or do you really just want them to bring them all to you? If you do, you're slowing down, and that's going to be a major part of the book later on, tempo. With regard to training and education and friction, something the book talks about is that it's difficult to gain an appreciation for friction if you haven't experienced it yourself. If you think about what we've said so far, the idea of why things just become difficult almost seemingly on their own would be hard to articulate in a classroom environment. So, how do you prepare for this, even though you don't have that big sale coming up or a big manufacturing change, or what if you're not quite ready to bring on board a major change in the technology that your engineering team uses? What you can do is anytime you train basically how you operate in just about everything, you want to keep it flexible enough. You want to avoid building what I call a house of cards, where you can imagine this house where all these playing cards are stacked up on top of each other, where you need to simulate combat conditions or real market dynamics or real business conditions in everything you do. Marine Corps calls that training like you fight. The next concept is uncertainty. And all actions take place in what's called in the book the fog of war. And it's a little bit related to the idea of friction, but you never really know the full story. You never really know if your customer is going to pay what you're asking them to pay. You never really know the total technical solution until you experiment. With people, you never really know what they're thinking until you confront issues. The way you reduce fog is by gaining information and understanding, but it's important to realize that you're never going to have full information, all the information you'd ever want, and full understanding. War is intrinsically unpredictable in the book. Quote from the book. And what you need to navigate through that is military judgment. So you need to cultivate judgment in your leaders and yourself as well. And while experience is the best teacher of this, education, training, books, self-study is also a very powerful tool that you have in your toolbox. Probably the worst scenario is if you have people with low levels of experience who don't study, who don't try to improve themselves. Where are they getting their new ideas? Where are they getting those inputs? Now, let's talk about uncertainty in the idea of fear. You have people, maybe you're one of them, once they come up with an uncertain situation, they stop, they're paralyzed by what could happen. And it's easy to say people shouldn't be like that, but the real question for you is, have you prepared them to deal with that situation? One of the ways that you prepare people to deal with those situations is you tell them what you expect. And the other one is, if they make a mistake in a situation like that and you react harshly, then you're taking a step back in this category. You need people to have the boldness to move forward, but that's largely dependent on how you interact with them as their leader. I like to think of it as, I can tolerate ignorance. If you don't know something, then we owe you that. We owe you the training to get up to speed. But if there's something that you plainly do know how to do and are blowing it off or just not working hard enough at it, lack attention to detail, to me, that's the worst. Laziness is unforgivable. Dealing with uncertainty, talked about it a little bit up front. Flexible plans, deliberate planning for contingencies or things that could happen, developing standard operating procedures that everybody has input on, and it really reflects the way you want to do things, and fostering initiative in your people, which is what I just talked about, is how do you react when they make a decision, particularly if it doesn't go as planned? Do you react harshly, or do you take a minute to consider why they made that decision and coach them through it to make them better next time? Another aspect of that is keeping your customers' heads in the game when you work through the sale of a product or a service. Remember, two animated, independent wills. Not simply you convincing, it's both of you. The book talks about one of the sources of uncertainty being this idea of non-linearity. Non-linearity or decisive effects are when you have something that is seemingly a very small aspect of whatever you're trying to do. Manufacturing environment, maybe it could be a level of detail on drawings, or it could be the routing of material. When you look at it in itself, it doesn't seem like it would be a huge impact on what you're trying to do, but you do have these situations or these aspects of operations in that case that have what we call disproportionate effects. So, for example, on a manufacturing example, if something is left out of a drawing, that information does not move forward with the material, you're not going to end up with the product that you anticipate. So a small detail had a disproportionate effect. And the definition of a decisive effect is something that has an effect greater, much greater than beyond what is intended. And that could be a positive or a negative effect. You terminate somebody for poor performance, you could have a decisive effect with that, good or bad. People could see that you're getting serious about maintaining a high standard, or you could have an effect if that person's really well liked on the negative side as well. So you have to be aware of that. Risk is inherent in war and every operation. The way that it was best explained to me, I thought, was that in the project management world, for example, every project has risk. It may be very close to zero, but it's not ever zero. And that's kind of related to the idea of nonlinearity, where small things can have big impacts. So when you assess risk, you want to do so in a very logical manner, be data driven. And risk is one of these words that I think is used a lot, but to be good at it, you have to be able to manipulate and research what's happened in your past and quantify that to apply it in the future. What could happen? Do I know how likely it is that it could happen? And what's it going to cost me? What am I going to do about it? Am I going to accept that? Am I going to prepare for it to happen? Or am I going to mitigate it? In warfare, risk largely has to do with leaving yourself weaker in one area so that you can gain strength in another. And this is a little bit related to what you might deal with regarding competition for resources. Do I need a bigger sales team at the expense of my execution team, or vice versa? Because you can't be strong everywhere. And how often do we convince ourselves that we can be? Probably more than we should. And not without, and sometimes it's without realizing it. And then you have chance. Chance isn't necessarily the opposite of risk, where if you look at risk, it's possible to foresee something happening. Chances you can't really control. You may not have seen this coming. You may not have seen something coming. And as the book states, chance does not favor you or your competition exclusively. It applies equally to both of you. And chance isn't always negative. Chance could be something that happens in your favor. And are you ready? Do you have the team that's ready to exploit that? Do you have the information flow? Are people sensitized to look for certain conditions and empowered to make decisions without lengthy or time-intensive approval processes? Can you exploit positive chance? The next idea is fluidity. In war and in your business environment, everything is interrelated. And it's important for us not to do what the book calls view each episode in isolation. Too often we prepare for predictable scenarios. We make assumptions that make our day easier or make our situations easier to decide on. But in a fluid organization, decisions are made and the organization is able to proceed based on assumptions that are data-driven, ideally, and sustains an overall high operational tempo. Do you have people in your organization that camp out on administrative or non-value-added activities that the customer's not asking for, but are purely internal requirements? Leaders can't let people like this slow the organization down. You need to attack the big time wasters. In the military, an example is to be able to operate at night. Do your people have the training and the equipment, night vision, to not have to stop operations during the dusk? Can they continue to operate when the sun goes down? There's something equivalent for your business, some capability that's going to allow them to get more out of each day. Disorder. Things are inherently chaotic and they get more so over time. It's important for leaders to be able to operate in this environment, not expect the opposite, which a lot of times we do. A lot of times we say that things are going to get better and we fail to do the things necessary to make that the case. The book talks about things not unfolding like clockwork. So what do? What's your general framework for operating and executing, for planning? Do people know what everybody else in the team is responsible for, who they can rely on in certain situations? This is a big one that I talk about a lot, is we overestimate the fact that people don't really know what different parts of the organization do or who's responsible for what. But this is one way to effectively deal with disorder. Complexity, talked about that a little bit, but complexity as it pertains to people. Anything with people is going to be messy. I remember thinking in Iraq, when you had a tribal organization, you had a government organization, you had the Americans, you had Al-Qaeda, everybody with opposite aims. If you go back to the wrestler analogy, you might have like 5 wrestlers. But I remember thinking that most situations, probably all situations, were some shade of gray. Nothing was black and white. You have to realize this in your organization. And if you have leaders that are not able to look at life like that, if you have leaders that are not able to look at things like that, then you have to take a look at what they're responsible for. If they're leading large groups, They may not be the best people equipped to do that. The book talks about the effects of warfare being achieved by the collective behavior of the group, not just one person. Sometimes we give two standards out, one for somebody with the experience who maybe has been in the team a long time, hard to challenge. You need a really strong leader to do that. And maybe you don't have it. But we have to convince ourselves as leaders that the real effects, the real accomplishments of the group are going to be accomplished by just that, the group, not one individual. They have one standard across the team. The human dimension. We may have technology that helps us do our job well, may be required to do our job at all. But it comes down to the people that are on your team. And do your leaders appreciate the human dimension? I mentioned the quote from Napoleon, the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. So critical for us to consider that. And how do we push through those low-level or even high-level obstacles? The will. Am I leading an organization where I'm encouraging and rewarding people who can get through obstacles on their own? Or am I creating an environment where people are dependent on me because it makes me feel good? There's a section of the book that talks about fear and danger. Hopefully you don't have a dangerous situation in your business, but you do have fear. And people will need to be able to operate with fear. And the way they do that is being supported by managers and leaders who encourage, who make people realize that it's okay to make decisions based on what your experience is and your responsibilities are. And that if that decision doesn't work out, there's not going to be that negative reaction or undue negative reaction. But people make decisions based on their emotions. And how do you reduce fear in your organization? Your experienced people have to bring the less experienced along, regardless of titles. Especially if somebody's brand new to the organization, you need to have what I call a battle buddy for that person, somebody who is on the peer level and available to show them how things work. And more importantly, they can ask questions with zero attribution concerns. And this leads into what the book describes as physical, mental, and moral. We talked about that a little bit. The moral forces, for us as leaders, it's important, this is researched, to understand that our integrity as leaders is the number one concern of the people on our teams. They need to know and be assured that what they're hearing from us is the truth, is what's really going on in the organization. They need that job. They're developing as professionals, and they're relying on you to keep the organization healthy and moving forward. And the only way they're going to be able to tell that is based on what you tell them. And if they're not sure what you're telling them is the truth, that's going to come into question. Overall, are the leaders on your team evaluating their people in terms of the mental, moral, and physical dimensions? Are they considering who's struggling and needs help? Or is there just some unrealistic expectation that people should know how to do things just because they're there? They're lucky to have the job. Real leaders are preparing their people to deal with the real environments that they live in. The evolution of war, things change. Technology changes things. The nature of war stays the same, but warfare itself does change. How is our business changing? How reliant on how we've done things in the past are we? Unnecessarily so. Are you setting the team up to be surprised by a technological advance or a new way of doing things? And the study of warfare is divided up into science and art, and this applies to us in leading our organizations as well. On one hand, you have the science, the capabilities, the training requirements, the infrastructure that we need to do our job as a business. But while the art is largely focused on the people aspect of it, it's not entirely. Leaders have to be able to synthesize the capabilities and the outputs of different parts of their organization. It's not simply a matter of adding up everything that happens and getting a sum total, and there's your business. Real leaders appreciate the interrelationships within the organization and know when to emphasize one aspect or another to get that max benefit for the group. Your sales team may be doing great, but your execution team, your engineering, your project management, your manufacturing may be struggling. Leaders know how to react to that, or better yet, be proactive and get ahead of it. That's the art of leading an organization. In conclusion, the main points of the first part of warfighting, the clash of the independent wills, sometimes competition for resources, market share, whatever the case may be, talent. And war is an extreme test of people's will. And our goal as leaders is to develop people to the point where they can overcome obstacles. They have the will to do so on their own. Not just they can do it, but they are going to do it. And also as leaders, we're focused on people's states of mind. They're not at 100% all the time. Neither are we. Preparing people to deal with uncertain situations, to deal with risk, to make decisions in the face of uncertainty, help us to thrive in this chaotic and uncertain environment that we all face. It doesn't need to be a war. The next video is going to be on the theory of war, how we prepare and wage war itself, and how you might do something comparable in your organization. How do you prepare to be a market leader? What aspects of the way you lead that organization are going to help you do that? If this type of instruction is something that you'd like to bring into your organization, my contact info is in the profile here. We'd love to help you do just that. In the meantime, lead by example, lead from the front.